there's a Tongan wellbeing model, or it's a model of wellbeing written by a Tongan called Sione Tuitahi, and it's called the Whanua model. One thing that it's very explicit on is the importance of relationship and connections, from people to ecology. And so not just the person to people, but the person to people to environment, and to the wider context. So of even that sort of chronological context of the past, future, and present.
Yeah.
So one thing that I have reflected on over the last few months is, and actually nearly got into writing an article with a great colleague that maybe you should speak to as well, was the idea of, we often delineate groups or different societies in terms of being individualistic or collectivist. I think that Pacific, and if I can include my Māori cousins in this, I think our worldviews are not just collectivist but connectivist. So there's a real sense of connectivism, like everything's connected, and that's just the way we see things. And so this leans really well to systems aware approaches in well-being, when we can sort of place the person as being connected to many things, and that those many things can and will often impact on that person's well-being. So it's about being able to optimize the whole system wherever possible to make well-being more likely.
All right, welcome to Researching Happy with Dr. Matthew Iasiello. This is the weekly podcast all about the stories behind the studies of the happiness and well-being research world. So welcome to episode 21. This week we chat with someone who came highly recommended to the show, which is Paul Tupou-Vea. So Paul is the Director of Clifftop Wellbeing in New Zealand and is the former president of the New Zealand Association of Positive Psychology. Paul has years of experience in wellbeing promotion in schools and works to meet the diverse wellbeing needs and challenges of learners, teachers, leaders, and the community around the school. And that was really the part of the chat I think I enjoyed the most. Paul really brings something that is missing in a lot of wellbeing work, which is connection, sort of seeing the bigger picture. Science has this pesky habit of atomizing the human experience, meaning breaking down our experiences into, their most basic parts, which can be obviously useful for research purposes, but it really stops working when we try and apply that knowledge into a complex setting like a school, or a workplace for that matter. In addition to hearing about his work, Paul really walked us through some Maori and Tongan models of well-being, and we discussed this issue that comes up again and again, times when science discovers a well-being lesson that traditional or indigenous communities have known for centuries. So welcome, Paul, to the episode. Stay in touch with us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And subscribing and rating the show really makes a huge difference. So if you could take a moment to do that, it would be greatly appreciated. But most importantly, share this episode with someone who you think is going to love it. That's really the way that I want this thing to grow, and really pleased with how it's going so far. So thanks, everybody, and enjoy the episode. All right, this is Researching Happy, and we've got a special guest, I guess, one that comes again, highly recommended, from New Zealand. So we're sticking with the theme of the Kiwis. I'm not sure if you're allowed to call them that anymore or what. I'm not sure. We've got Paul Tupou-Vea. So welcome, Paul.
Thanks, mate. Great to be able to hang out with you today.
Yeah, no problems. The Kiwi thing, is that an issue? No.
Depends who you talk to.
Okay.
I think we're in a period of maybe cultural enlightenment. And so I know it's an interesting time here in New Zealand at the moment. We've got an election coming up. in the next few weeks as well. But yeah, I think most people in New Zealand are happy and proud to call themselves Kiwis. And then there's a sort of growing thought that maybe there's another way to define ourselves and talk about ourselves rather than referring to a native bird. And especially there's some contention where people who are less open to Māori culture are still happy to call themselves Kiwis, so there's some sort of pushback on that side as well. That's a long-winded answer to that, or maybe there's more to, there's some rabbit holes to go down there as well.
There you go. There was a bit of my own ignorance there showing through. So tell us a bit about yourself, Paul. So tell us about the work that you're doing in New Zealand.
Yeah, mate. Look, first of all, like yourself, I'm a dad. So I like to define myself in terms of my current state of being. Is that sort of, that, you know, living that dad life. And my wife's an educator as well. I think I heard yesterday, or when you were speaking to your previous guest, your wife's primary trained, so is mine. My wife works as a cultural curriculum designer. I like to think of her as a ninja, kind of good at everything she does. And so that's kind of my nucleus at the moment. But got lots of whānau. I grew up with 4 brothers and a sister here in Auckland. And sort of growing up here with sort of Tongan migrant parents, sort of in a time where, like, I suppose you kind of know how certain neighborhoods were set up, especially in the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of, especially with migrant communities, clustering, and so where I went to school was a sort of different community from where I was living, and then likewise at high school. So kind of grew up, you know, walking between worlds, cultural worlds as well as physical ones, and sort of noticing disparities and differences in the way that people lived, and how we did, and how well we did. So kind of notions of well-being before I could have even heard of the word, and then decided to sort of learn more about that when I left high school and went to uni, and I jumped into social sciences and thought I got a scholarship, so I was like, bang for buck, I'll study a conjoint, we'll do management, and it was through that management side that I kind of found sort of psychology as well, like, so, you know, found sort of self-determination theory through that side, and then I left uni and jumped into trying to meanwhile I was volunteering, doing kids camps during the holidays at uni, and then I leapt into youth development programs after graduating, and then decided to get into education, and through there found PosEd, and so I went down several rabbit holes through PosEd, and then ended up doing my master's at Melbourne, and my MAP, a master's in applied positive psychology, and I've been consulting for the last 5 years, under the label wellbeing consultant, but kind of doing a little bit like my wife, trying to ninja a whole lot of challenges and opportunities to deal with people and how we can do better. Yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Yeah. Great. And I mean, that's something we can go into a little bit as well, this idea of there's lots of motivated well-being people, whether they're sort of practitioners or consultants or whatever you want to call them, trying to sort of bootstrap their effort, right? Like, I hear that from yourself a little bit of you've got something that you want to achieve, but the reality is you sort of have to flow with the world and find where the money is and where it's actually sustainable to be doing your effort. So I think that's a pretty consistent theme across lots of different, aspects of well-being research, like even practice for us too.
Totally.
What was I going to say? Yeah, so you've been mostly in the education space so far.
That's right. I think education and you'd say youth development. So prior to getting into teaching, a lot of my efforts were focused on youth. I thought that if I was going to get sort of bang for buck for my effort anywhere in terms of change and impact, it would be with young people. For obvious logical reasons, thinking about sort of the pipelines of their lives and where they might go to if I can do impactful work with young people. So a lot of youth development stuff, and being a real nerd and trying to incorporate things like SDT, self-determination theory, into that, and then getting into education. And so through education, I've also kind of developed a bit of a framework for how I think we can create flourishing schools or thriving schools, and I've been able to do that really comprehensively with one or two schools, and now sort of lining up this opportunity at the moment with 3 schools sort of 15 minutes away from here, a local primary, middle or a junior college and senior college, to try and align what they're doing, not only in terms of like a general curriculum context, but also what they're doing around wellbeing development, wellbeing education.
Yeah, great. And so can you sort of roughly sketch out the framework so we have an idea of what it might look like compared to sort of average schooling? Yeah, well,
I suppose there's like there's a journey and the destination, right? And most schools are at some stage on the journey. Right? No one's really reached the stage of being a flourishing school. Although I've seen some schools doing fantastic work in that regard. So for me, I think the journey is really locally dependent and responsive. So responsive to the needs of the people in the school, and responsive to like their history and their needs looking forward. That is, it's also quite related. And so one thing that inspired me was sort of a framework that Geelong Grammar use around POS-Ed, which is to live, learn, and embed. So the idea being, learn, live, embed. So firstly, we need to learn about positive psychology and wellbeing science, and that's sort of really teacher and staff oriented. So us as practitioners need to learn the science, then we need to live it and sort of practice it for ourselves, understand how it's valuable, and how we can use it and where we can use it, and then to do the work and embed it. In my sort of framework, I take those 3 things and include 2 others, being to weave and to co-design. So weaving being so that kind of takes embed and it breaks it up to be really intentional about co-design, incorporating the community and taking the voice of all the stakeholders, but especially the learners themselves, the whānau or families of the school, and the staff and board and all those important stakeholders. And sort of in the past I've used an appreciative inquiry approach to do that co-design piece, which can gather some really rich voice, data and energy. And actually when you spoke to Annalise a few podcasts ago, her methodology sounded really familiar actually, like in terms of, was it reflexive? Can you remember it, Matt?
Not really. Reflexive thematic analysis.
Well, it'll come to mind. It was reflexive something analysis, and that kind of when she was talking, it really reflected how we went through the co-design in one of the big schools I did it with, and then the other being weave, which is to look at the whole school as a system and ensure that wellbeing doesn't just sit in a classroom. Or it doesn't happen in like period 2 on Wednesday, and then you go back to whatever happens in the next class. And so it's not only incorporating what we're learning into our pedagogy, into the way we teach, but also thinking about our systems within the school, our timetable, our environment, our sort of discipline or behavior management or restorative practices, to what extent those things, and what about our policies and procedures around safety, around community engagement, those sorts of things. So how do we align all of that stuff and do the weaving and make sure we've considered the science, so we're really setting up our schools or our organisations as systems that are wellbeing inducing, rather than having to tack it on and always be setting up interventions, which is things to add on. And as you may or may not hear, like schools are incredibly intense and busy places at the moment, both in Australia and New Zealand. I know there's a lot of talk about wellbeing crisis, and certainly with teachers, there's a lot of attrition from teachers. I know that's a thing in Australia and New Zealand. So actually a side rabbit hole. A couple of great friends of mine and myself, we've created an organisation called Teachers Well, which responds to the teacher wellbeing crisis, as we call it. We're doing that weave piece. So again, we've got that sort of learn, or as I call, learn, play, as I call it, instead of live. So I always encourage people to just have a play with it, try it out. So learn, play, share. So that's how we intentionally share the science, whether that's in the classroom or in the staff room, or actually, with the parent community as well. And then weave and co-design. So those 5 elements. And for me, those 5 elements aren't linear. They are it's up to the school to pick what is the most important thing that they need, what's the next step on their journey that's responsive to their needs and their goals, their sort of vision, which is different for each community. That's kind of the framework as I sketch it out, and it's exciting and it's interesting, and I think it gives schools some sense of autonomy over the journey, and it supports their competence to sort of say, oh, actually this is where we're already at. We're actually doing a lot of in this area, and what we need is that next bit there. I'll hand back to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no problem. That was an awesome answer. Thank you. And I think you've, I think people that are listening will go like, that's a few things come to mind. When we're talking schools, I think I see it like you mentioned, my wife's a school teacher too. People have this idea of school looking like what their school used to, and for most people, I'm assuming, schools right now don't look anything like schools of the past, even 20 or 30 years ago. Would you agree with that?
I would say that is the reality for a lot of people, but not for all. Like for a lot of schools, they will look really familiar.
Okay.
And even for some schools, that even the curriculum will look super similar. But yeah, for many people, it is really
okay, well then
different.
I'm glad glad I asked then, just to that clarifying point. It's not fair enough. But what I sometimes see around, and maybe it's just natural, it's the early days of something trying to be implemented, that it's like you kind of touched on, that weave bit was so good to hear, I guess, because people are out there, or maybe this doesn't happen again anymore, but this idea of like, all right, it's Wednesday afternoon, it's wellbeing class time now, where we learn about wellbeing and we talk about wellbeing. But if you're if you're misbehaving in the classroom, well, we go straight back to our very not well-being sort of punishment and conflict resolution approaches. So I'm really pleased to hear that idea of weaving, that this actually has to be something sort of across the entire system.
That's the goal, and I think that is a part of the journey that most schools perhaps haven't had the time and resource to invest in spending time in that. So sometimes that involves, like, taking a really good snapshot of where we're at. With some schools, I do an audit, and then there's thinking about how do we track and measure wellbeing across the community, and then we need to kind of decide what our vision for this is, which is part of the co-design. And if we're clear about that, let's come up with a plan or a strategy, and then it's doing the work of making that strategy a lived one. Like, it's not just a cool picture on the staff room wall or in the principal's office or in the shared drive. That it's something that everyone's actually embedding and living. And so through a couple of schools I worked with, we've even sort of co-designed its own model of wellbeing.
Yeah, great. Okay, and so the other bit I liked there was this idea of, looking at the whole school, but not just the school, the community. Again, it's probably a little bit in the same analogy of this idea of, like, we've got our wellbeing session. It's that 45 minutes or something where we talk wellbeing, and that's almost like this very, what would you call that? It's not coming to mind, but like, it's almost like an itemized way of living life, like it's very fractionated, if that's even a word. I don't think it is. This idea of, like, there's my school world, there's my home world, there's my community world, and that these things are all completely separate and don't interact with each other.
Yeah, that's right.
It's kind of in the vein of
quite like segmented, as you're saying.
Segmented, thank you.
Yeah. So
fragmented, I think, is what I was when I
nice.
invented the word fractionated. Yeah. So please go on.
Yeah, you're right, and one of the as a youth development practitioner, I sort of had this feeling, and a lot of like any of the listeners out there are youth workers or social workers, especially, or teachers. Sometimes we have this sense that, like, I can do what I can in the classroom, but I know that for this student, they've got a lot of barriers and hardship and challenges at home, and there's that sense of not being able to cross that the divide between those fragments or segments, and that holds back the development for the young person, for the student. So I think the work of great schools is to bridge that divide. Like, there's a lot of great research to say that educational outcomes are better when parents are involved, both in the learning process and with the school. So there's tons of that, but also as practitioners, we know that, like, if I'm teaching growth mindset, for example, just to pick a construct out of thin air, I can create that microclimate in the classroom where we're using that literacy that really supports growth mindset. Once they step out into another classroom, that might be different, and once they go home, that might be different again. Because I don't know about you, Matt, but when I grew up, like, it wasn't, we did a lot of labeling, which isn't great for, which is good for fixed mindset. So yeah, I think us being able to interact with parents and families, and to share some, like, that's that share piece again, like, to do some of that sharing of information. That sharing goes both ways, because there's a lot of especially cultural knowledge, but there's a lot of knowledge about the child, the young person, that the family holds, that would really benefit us as teachers to know in order to be more responsive in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And so have you got some, are you at the point where you've got some examples of, more interaction with parents or more involvement in parents? Is that sort of in the distance as a goal, or are you sort of trialing that at all so far?
I think there are a few schools doing that really well, just from the schools that I've been able to work with. Some examples of that, they really range just from, like at your kids' schools, Matt, or even where you went to school. There are times when, as a parent, you're invited into this community event, like cross-country or athletics or whatever it is. But then there's like sort of going beyond that into thinking about, well, we've got this sharing piece, like maybe we could do like a shared lunch thing, or like, people in our school community, for example, some schools have identified that food as a real central piece for the learners in their communities. Like, they like to gather around food, so let's do a lunch, and let's then make sure that we valuing and caring for and respecting our parents. So we'll say a few things, and we'll invite them to kind of do this workshop on the side. Like, if you step in here, we'll like to talk about screen time and cell phones, like as a challenge, and how do we support our young people with that, for example. So yeah, certainly seen a few schools starting to be creative around how they can interact with parent communities. And for a lot of schools, that's really tough, actually. Like, there's for many teachers, there's a bit of an anxiety around dealing with parents, parents with high expectations, especially, and that happens with certain schools with sort of more well-to-do or higher socioeconomic status families. But actually, it's across the whole school spectrum.
Yeah.
In small communities, it's really easy. But I'll just say that there are some cool stuff happening, and I'm hoping, I think for me, like the aim is that this becomes really normal, that it's just the standard thing, and that there's a bit more of a partnership between teachers and parents, or staff and families more broadly, in the sort of educational journey of the child.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that. I like that idea of partnership, because it doesn't seem, I mean, obviously I am hearing it from the teacher's side, and we're sort of straying just into personal experience, and that's okay, I guess, but it does seem to be that it's not a partnership, it's all expectations one way, of almost parents. I guess some of the things that would traditionally have been taught in by parents or in families are now sort of being handballed over to the educators, who already have a full plate and a full curriculum. So I'm with you on the idea of partnership. I think that's really nice language.
Yeah, and I think
the other.
Sorry, you go, Matt.
No, go, please. Sorry, we've got a bit of a delay happening with the internet here. That's okay. Please go.
No, no worries. I was just going to say something I've reflected on is that where possible, like it's easier to have that partnership agreement at the outset, right? So when you when you start your kid's first day at school, to know that, actually, okay, so the vibe here at this school is that there's a partnership and that I'm involved. It's not just like a drop off and like a spray and walk away situation. Like, you're gonna do the education stuff, and then I'll get them at 3:00, and then we'll do the home stuff. And in schools where they're starting off this partnership approach, like, there has to be a clear landmark or a delineation, a point where it's like, hey, and this is where the co-design stuff is useful. But if you're not doing co-design, then it's just like gathering the community and doing a bit more, being intentional about how you communicate what we're doing and why, and then how it's going to happen and what your role is in it, and hopefully getting that feedback and buy-in through that.
Yeah. I can imagine the difficulty, like the first difficulty that really comes to mind would be like, I guess, the busyness of parents, the busyness of sort of modern day people, that maybe they do kind of want, there'd be some people who kind of do want to treat teaching a little bit more like, not childcare, but in the sense of like, that's my time where I'm at work, I really can't be around. Like, is that a challenge, or is that just in my head?
It can be, certainly can be, which is again why having that agreement, that walking into the partnership with your eyes open about what you're getting into is always helpful. But then again, like it's sort of like in SDT, when there's part of it when we talk about motivation, and it's sort of like once you know why it's important, then you see value in it, and you're more likely to be able to allocate your resources to it because you understand, and then, you're more motivated to actually do it. So yes, like time is a real thing for everyone at the moment. Cost of living crisis, and people working harder and longer by a lot of metrics. But we've found that even with that being the reality, once families understand what it is that we're trying to do, all parents, and you'll know, like we just want the best for our kids. And so when we know that an action leads to a better outcome for our kids, then I'm for it. Like I'll turn up, I'll be there, I'll give up my time, I'll take some time off work. That's what we've found so far.
Yeah, nice. And I guess even I'm just thinking, like, say you're thinking like, even if you are a person in that situation for whatever circumstance or whatever reason where you can't be at the school, you have to be at work, you'd still prefer that your kids went to a school that had more parental involvement on average than one that had less.
Again, I think it's going to be different for everyone, but the more I know about why I need to be involved, the more informed my choices around it, and more likely that I'll be motivated to be involved. So, I think here in New Zealand, like schools by and large are doing great work, and so when my kids' school are holding a community event, wherever possible I'll drop stuff, because I know what they're doing and why, and that's not always possible, and that's the reality for a lot of parents isn't possible, and that's okay. Like you've got to keep doing life at the same time. But I think that in the ideal scenario, we've got more synergy, at least communication, if not presence. Like if the parents know what's happening in the school and why, and are able to align anything at home. Like if I know that they're focusing on sustainability at school this week, or we're looking at the practice of gratitude, for example. And the school gives me a little bit of background about why that's important. Here's an exercise or two we could do around the dinner table. That's awesome. Yeah,
that's nice. Yeah, you're almost. I mean, we're obviously not at school. My youngest one is 3.5. But even I can sort of resonate with that experience. He's been doing these like toddler jiu-jitsu classes that just happen to be hosted by a school nearby, like a gym nearby. Mm-hmm. And it's not something I was probably ever expecting us to sign up for, but it's a lot of fun where you're partnered with your child and you sort of just muck around and learn wrestling stuff and whatever. But a couple of the things, like it's almost made our home life more fun because we have these exercises, these fun things that I personally would never have thought of, that we take away from the wrestling class, and we can do it like at night times. So I can imagine that kind of that immersion of learning across, that sort of it's a consistency of learning from home to the classroom has benefits just for your own relationship with your child.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, I think I mentioned at the start of our chat, like that experience of walking between worlds. Like for me, it was quite a big one, because like having Tongan parents who were still kind of learning about mainstream society and how to be in it. It was quite different walking between them. So even for our kids right now, like there's different norms, usually different norms at home and at school, and being able to bridge those divides can be really cool for our kids, like to see links, like real world links, and yeah, links, and then cool. And use common language across those circles and worlds as well.
Yeah, that's nice. We're back. Thank you, Paul. You've been sort of very flexible with some technical difficulties there. So we're live again. So the last thing where we were just covering off was, I think you were talking about, I think we were both talking about this idea of synergy of, you're learning across your home life, your community life, your school life, whatever, that you want some sort of overlap. We're not just these segmented people, this is my school world, this is my home life, whatever. And where I wanted to go next, I guess, was this idea that, I definitely feel it, say, with sort of Italian culture, this idea of, ancient traditions have sort of known what science has just worked out. They've known it for centuries, what science has just figured out. And I think the well-being space is a little bit like that sometimes. And so I'd love to get into a little bit of your sort of cross-cultural work.
Yeah, thanks, mate. And I can that resonates with me. Your example, in one way, a phrase that comes to mind that is that perhaps fourth wave positive psychology is maybe first wave indigenous wisdoms on well-being, and so it's great that we can prove it empirically. Hope debatable to many, depending on who you talk about and how valid the science is, but there's a growing acknowledgement of certain things being beneficial for our well-being, that certainly in our experience, or my experience with my family's, my heritage, Tongan culture, it's been in the culture for a while. Some of the things that we're learning about in positive psychology, and likewise with Maori culture. And so there are some beautiful ideas and wisdoms that within Maori culture that we're able to apply in a across organizations, actually. So most organizations here in New Zealand are starting to learn about and incorporate aspects of Maori culture, if not at a values level. And some of that is deep and some of that is still surface, like we're still learning. We're learning about the words and what they mean and how we really live those things in an organization. But we're starting to see and appreciate the cultural wisdoms that exist in here in Māori culture and other Pacific cultures as well, that are used to be more responsive to the communities that we serve.
Yeah, great. And we were impressed, I guess. Myself and Yoop, we were in New Zealand 2019, presenting at some conferences and stuff, and had a great time. And we sort of came across the I've just pulled it up, a Maori model of well-being, I guess. And it's, people, for some reason, they shy away from the word holistic. I don't know why, whatever. But, this does seem, it kind of holistic in my mind, that it strikes all the points, and you read it and you go like, oh, this makes perfect sense. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Te Ware Tapawa, Is that something that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I am. Te whare tapa wha. So the WH makes the F
Oh,
sound.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I've got it in front of me. I'll put it up on the screen, but basically a model of well-being that's why don't you describe it? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk to it. Essentially, I don't know if the author would agree with. I would say that it was co-designed by Sir Mason Jury, Legend of a Man. I'll call him my uncle. Back in 1984, great year by the way. And so he essentially had an in-depth discourse with his colleagues and across her Māori colleagues working across health and social services. And so we've got doctors, nurses, social workers, all sorts of practitioners that are really, it was their daily work to support the well-being of their communities who were largely Māori people. And so through their discussions, they sort of, what came out were that well-being or hauora could be defined by these four facets. Or so te whare tapa wha is the house of four sides, and each tapa or side or wall represents a different aspect of well-being or hauora. And so those aspects are physical well-being or taha tinana being your body, taha whānau or your social well-being, incorporating all your people relationships and connections, taha hinengaro, which is mental emotional well-being, and taha wairua or spiritual well-being. So all that sense of connectedness to everything beyond you, that's in the past, in the future, in the world. Sense of meaning and purpose are some of the words that I sort of incorporate into that taha wairua as well. Yeah, so that's and like you said, I love it because it is holistic, and some of the holes that we can poke in some post-psych frameworks are that it ignores certain aspects like especially the physical well-being component. So for me, as I look at well-being models, if it ignores something so important like physical well-being, then I find it really hard to use it with my clients or with my schools, because we just cannot ignore the impact that something like sleep, for example, or nutrition, or can have on your mental well-being or your psychological well-being. So I like it because it's holistic. I also like it because of the synergistic element of it, so that one wall supports the other. One weakened wall, my physical well-being, when I don't sleep very well, that's going to impact on my mental emotional well-being on that wall, and all of the others. And so the structural integrity of the whole whare or house is impacted. I also like the analogy of strengthening the house before the storms. So that is like the storms of life, or all the various challenges and that we are bound to encounter through uncertainty, pandemics, loss of loved ones, all sorts of things that just happen in life. We can kind of view as like the storms that impact on the house or the whare. And we can strengthen each component or each wall to strengthen our well-being, to be more resilient in tough times. Also, in more recent visualizations of the model, like the one you put up, might have whenua, or the earth or ground underneath, the footing underneath the house. And that sort of is an important reminder for us that, we don't live in a vacuum. Like a human doesn't just float in space. Like we need to be connected to our environment, our sort of ecology. And that's something that we know about Māori and Pacific wellbeing is connection to place is really important. So having that sense of not only where I'm from, but where is home. Where is it that I can really plant my feet and say that this is me. Like I feel connected here. And then there's also, ties in notions of which we're starting to think of in positive psychology around global well-being, like well-being of the planet. Because as you know, for a flourishing world or flourishing population, we need a flourishing earth or at least a healthy planet to sustain us as well. So that having that whenua aspect on that whare model is really important as well.
Great. And so you've already given us some examples, I guess, of how that ties into your work, this idea of, if we go into the school and we're just talking about one wall, that's not a very good way to build a house, basically. Is it more than that, that you're coming in with a holistic model? Are there other ways that you've sort of integrate these ideas? And obviously that like you say, there are more Pacific models. Are they very different? Are they similar?
The Pacific models are actually really similar. But one commonality they have is that they are quite systems friendly. So they're systems aware models. So when I look at wellbeing models from post-psych in particular, the lineage of them is usually focused on the individual. And that can be applied to the individual living within a social group or sometimes in an environmental context. But with the Māori and Pacific models, they're more leaning towards looking at the society, looking at the community. What does it take for a community to thrive or flourish? What do we need? Because of that, I think they can be a lot more nuanced. For me, as someone that stepped out of uni into a social science degree, and then, along with psychology, when I arrived at positive psychology, I thought this was one of the things that was missing, was that sense of what about the societal impacts on well-being? What about the environmental impacts on well-being? And I know that these things are being researched and looked at within post-psych, but increasingly now, which is awesome. And when you got back from the latest Congress, I was encouraged to hear that there was more discourse on around those types of topics. Am I right in saying that?
No, absolutely. And I like where you're going with that, in the idea of you want a model that's inclusive to the individual and to the community and the system. And if you're starting from this, if you've got the starting point of this is an individualistic model, then it's much more uphill work probably to think about how this applies to a community. And I guess it seems to be almost then the theme, I guess, in a way, of your work. I don't know if you see it that way, but I guess I'm kind of hearing it, this idea of a system. And like you sort of said, here are the things we need for a community to work. Going back a few steps, that's parents and schools working together, for example.
Yeah, mate. Yeah. I think you're right there. And for me, I didn't even realize it, because it's just the way I see the world. And that's kind of a product of my kind of worldview, which is also a cultural thing as well. One thing there's a Tongan wellbeing model, or it's a model of wellbeing written by a Tongan called Sione Tuitahi, and it's called the whanua model. One thing that it's very explicit on is the importance of relationship and connections, from people to ecology. And so not just the person to people, but the person to people to environment, and to the wider context. So of even that sort of chronological context of the past, future, and present.
Yeah.
So one thing that I have reflected on over the last few months is, and actually nearly got into writing an article with a great colleague that maybe you should speak to as well. Was the idea of, we often delineate groups or different societies in terms of being individualistic or collectivist. I think that Pacific and if I can include my Māori cousins in this, I think our worldviews are not just collectivist but connectivist. So there's a real sense of connectivism, like everything's connected, and that's just the way we see things. And so this leans really well to systems aware approaches in well-being, when we can sort of place the person as being connected to many things, and that those many things can and will often impact on that person's well-being. So it's about being able to optimize the whole system wherever possible to make well-being more likely.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. You should write that article, please. And you can give a shout out, I guess, to the name of your colleague, unless they should remain.
Yeah, for sure. She
a
won't
mystery.
mind. Yeah, no, Dr. Denise Quinlan.
Oh, great. I know Denise. Yeah, for sure. Oh,
There
that
you
would be
go.
really cool.
Yeah.
That would be really cool. I mean, I don't know her that well, but I know who she is, and I've definitely spoken to her about coming on the show, which will be somewhere in the works. So, yeah, I like that because I mean, it is the thing that we often hear because I like. So, would you say by going into that idea of connectivism, you
Mhm.
sort of reject the individualism versus collectivism sort of ideology? Because I can imagine that a collectivist group of people, there are obviously individuals within that.
Absolutely. So no, it's not a rejection of the individual at all. Yeah, I think that would be at our own peril, but I think it's about balance and how
Yeah.
where you focus your attention, right?
Yep. Yep.
So there, especially with Pacific people and Māori people living now within systems both here and in Australia and abroad in the States, for example, which is largely a Western society with Western norms, like how being able to just being more mindful of that need to be a connectivist within more of an individualist setup. And it is what it is. Like, I think we have got mental health stats, particularly around trigger word suicide, has been really bad for just bad in general in New Zealand, but especially just worse for Māori and Pacific peoples, worse for men as well. And I think some of the challenges that our people have is that we have moved, like our ancestry, like just a generation ago, we're living in the islands where it is extremely connectivist. You rely on your neighbors, on everyone for everything. You share, you support, and that's just the norm. Here you live in a box. Some of us have bigger boxes than others. Sometimes you don't know who's on the other side in the box next door, and you kind of trundle along to another box and you sit over there and you do your thing. Sometimes you get to be yourself in that box, but sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have to like learn how to be someone else that you're not sure how to be. So there's a sort of displacement that can happen, and it's only like, I don't want to overstep in this, but it's a thought of mine that this is part of the challenge and opportunity for us actually. In that, I always just think like it's better together, and I think of that well-known quote by Sean Aker, who says happiness is a team sport.
Nice.
And so I think life is a team sport, well-being is a team sport. in general, stuff is just better together, right? And so if we can start to, certainly for Māori Pacific people, when we start to be able to live that more as a reality, then our well-being outcomes are generally better. And I'd go further to sort of propose that there'd be well-being outcomes for the general population would be better if we can, make connectivism more normal.
Absolutely. And I think you can look at it even at a neighborhood level, I guess. Like, maybe this is completely obvious, but just this idea of, obviously like a Western neighborhood is obviously very different to the context of an Indigenous culture like you're talking, but even this idea of how many Australians or New Zealanders or Westerners in general could resonate with the idea that, maybe your parents would know their neighbors and would happily borrow whatever, like some bread or something if they needed to. And do they still act the same way with their neighbors today? Just in terms of like how little connection we really have. So like the walls of those boxes, I guess, in your analogy, are high. I don't know if we're going to talk about higher or lower boxes or whatever, but the walls of the boxes are more closed.
Yeah, for
okay.
sure. And like for, I don't know, sometimes, I just have these insights through noticing what's normal for my family is like not normal elsewhere.
Oh.
I always remember, would have these, sometimes in a big birthday in Pacific and Tongan culture, like it's a big deal. Like you roasting pigs on a spit in the backyard, and there's a lot of people, there's a lot of food left over. Everyone takes food. And remember at my cousin's place, he would always make huge plates of food and get his kids to take one to each of the neighbors.
Yeah, that's cool.
And it wasn't always, obviously, because it was normal for my cousin's family. It's just what they do. And sometimes, that just creates relationship, creates sometimes reciprocity. Not always, but if in terms of like in a real sense, it was not always like, oh, therefore have this then. But sometimes it was just like more in that warmth of relationship, the more it would make it more likely that someone would say hi or greet you, or that if they heard a weird noise on during the day when you're at work, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just like little micro things like that, isn't it? It's not a wholesale, it's not like the structure of society needs to radically shift in a way, right? Just to get some of those benefits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's
small
cool.
things.
Yeah, awesome. So do you see, obviously, like, we're starting to think about schools, and I've got a teacher for a wife. You've got, I'm guessing, kids at school and also a teacher for a wife. So schools are very front of mind, I guess, for us at the moment. Like, I mean, yourself and myself, I'm assuming. But I do get this sense that schools are really at the heart of, like, if you had to say, like, where's the heart of a community, maybe you can't even answer that. But I wonder do you think that schools, like, obviously that's been the majority of your work, do you see schools as this integration sort of hub of a community?
I see absolute potential for schools to be a community hub. They are in many ways already. I think, I know in Australia and New Zealand our education systems, there's a lot of questions being asked about each of our systems at the moment. And in New Zealand, my hope is that we start to, because as you know, like when you start to do wellbeing at a population level, the actual execution of that is dependent on how the government sort of divvies up ministries and their portfolios and their budgets, etc. And with schools, like there's just that's the Ministry of Education, for example. But as we know, like, well, in my thinking, connectivist maybe, but there's like so many possibilities for the Ministry of Youth Development or Social Development or Ministry of Health, etc., etc. So many avenues for, like, if we worked in if we went beyond the traditional education model, the traditional model for schools, and the way we think about them, and what the role of a school is to, prepare them for industry, sometimes tertiary education, et cetera, et cetera. There's more opportunity to develop schools as centers for community well-being. If there was more sort of like an interdisciplinary collaboration between community partners, whether that's through health centers, through mental health and well-being support and counseling, all sorts of things for intergenerational well-being, intergenerational education as well.
Yeah.
So I really see educational as key for social mobility, for persons and peoples to do better and to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. And often with a lot of financial hardship, like education being a really great tool to shift yourself from, one socioeconomic status to another, maybe. And that's more possible. Like I'm more ready to support my kids if I have more of social capital. And the basic example is like for my parents, they went through a Tongan education system and then raised their kids in a New Zealand education system. And they didn't, they were passionate. They were, they had a lot of care and expectation for what we should become. And they weren't always able to help us navigate through this education system because they just didn't have that cultural capital. They had other beautiful cultural capital they were able to benefit from.
Yep.
But in order to do well here, it's like how to study, what to study, when to study, how to eat, what to eat, when to eat. Like, it's like certain ways of being that are just normal intergenerational knowledge for a lot of other families that have just been through it. My parents know about shares and stocks and they're teaching me and all that sort of stuff. Whereas for me, it wasn't like that. So if our schools were able to do more of that intergenerational education, or if it's not just schools, like whatever schools look like, when there are pathways for equipping more people, meeting people where they are, and being able to equip people for social mobility, often through education, then I think we'll just be giving people more autonomy and competence and relatedness at the same time, right?
Absolutely. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Paul. I think that's a really great place to close the conversation. Was there anything sort of that we didn't cover that you wanted to mention, or?
We could probably go for ages on different topics. But happy to have spoken to you today about education a whole bunch, and culture. But yeah, I hope it's been, hope there's been some useful nuggets for yourself and maybe a couple of listeners out there. I appreciate your time and everything you're doing with the podcast and your work in general. You're a bit of a legend in the research space. So appreciate your work, mate.
No problems. I'm really pleased that someone's listening and someone's paying attention, I guess. So that's kind of nice. I really appreciate it. So keep up the good work, and I'll look out, obviously you've got enough work to do, but I'll look out for the connectivism article coming out soon.
Nice, mate. Yeah, we'll make it happen.
Cheers.
Cheers.